A beloved schoolteacher failed to show up for lunch with her identical twin sister, and when family members checked her home, they discovered a scene so disturbing it would haunt investigators for nearly 3 decades. But when cutting-edge DNA technology finally identifies the killer, police make a shocking discovery that reveals he had been hiding in plain sight all along. January 14, 1995, began as a crisp winter morning in Beaumont, Texas, where 31-year-old Catherine Edwards was preparing for what should have been an ordinary Saturday. Catherine, known to her friends as Mary Catherine, lived in a charming townhome in a quiet residential neighborhood, where she had built a life centered around education, family, and community service. Catherine was an elementary school teacher at a local school where she had worked for 7 years after graduating from college with a degree in education. Students adored her patient teaching style and creative classroom activities, while parents appreciated her dedication to helping every child succeed. Colleagues described her as someone who stayed late to help struggling students, volunteered for school events, and never hesitated to spend her own money on classroom supplies. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair and warm brown eyes, Catherine had a smile that could brighten any room. She was known for her professional wardrobe of colorful dresses and cardigans, her collection of educational books that filled every corner of her townhome, and her habit of grading papers late into the evening while classical music played softly in the background. Catherine lived alone in her 2-story townhome, a cozy space that reflected her personality perfectly. The walls were covered with artwork created by her students over the years, photographs of family gatherings and school events, and motivational posters about learning and growth. Her kitchen was always stocked with ingredients for baking cookies that she would bring to school for special occasions or share with neighbors who had helped her with various tasks. The most important person in Catherine's life was her identical twin sister, Alison Broccato. The two women had been inseparable since childhood, sharing everything from clothes to secrets to dreams about their futures. Even as adults with separate careers and homes, they talked on the phone daily and met for lunch at least twice a week. Their bond was so strong that they often finished each other's sentences and seemed to share an intuitive understanding of each other's thoughts and feelings. Alison worked as a nurse at a local hospital and lived about 20 minutes away from Catherine's townhome. She was married with 2 young children, but she always made time for her sister. The twins had grown up in a close-knit family that emphasized education, faith, and community service. Their parents, Dr. Robert Edwards and his wife Patricia, had instilled in both daughters a strong sense of responsibility to help others and make positive contributions to their community. Catherine's daily routine was predictable and fulfilling. She woke up early to prepare lessons and grade papers before heading to school. Her classroom was always the first to have lights on in the morning, and often the last to go dark in the evening. After school, she participated in faculty meetings, tutored students who needed extra help, or worked on special projects that would enhance her teaching effectiveness. Weekends were precious time for Catherine to relax, spend time with family, and pursue her hobbies. She enjoyed reading historical novels, working in her small garden behind the townhome, and volunteering at her church, where she helped coordinate community outreach programs. Saturday lunches with Alison had become a cherished tradition that both sisters protected fiercely from other commitments. On Friday evening, January 13th, Catherine had spoken with Alison to confirm their lunch plans for the following day. They arranged to meet at 12:30 at a restaurant near the hospital where Alison worked. Catherine seemed excited about the lunch and mentioned that she had some interesting stories to share about her students and their latest classroom projects. Catherine spent Friday evening at home, as was her usual routine. She prepared lessons for the following week, graded a stack of math tests, and called her parents to check on their health and share news about her students. Neighbors later reported seeing lights on in her townhome until around 10 o'clock, which was typical for Catherine, who often worked late into the evening. The townhome where Catherine lived was part of a well-maintained complex in a safe neighborhood. Most residents were young professionals or small families who chose the area for its proximity to schools, hospitals, and shopping centers. Crime was rare, limited to occasional car break-ins or minor theft. The idea that something violent could happen in such a peaceful community seemed impossible to residents who had lived there for years. Saturday morning arrived cold and grey, with temperatures in the 40s and a light drizzle that made the streets slick and gloomy. Catherine typically slept later on weekend mornings, using Saturday as an opportunity to rest after long weeks of teaching and grading. Her usual Saturday routine included light housekeeping, grocery shopping, and preparing for the week ahead. At 12:30 sharp, Alison arrived at the restaurant where she and Catherine had planned to meet. She secured a table for 2, and waited, checking her watch periodically and expecting her sister to arrive at any moment. Catherine was rarely late for anything, and she had never missed one of their Saturday lunches without calling to explain. As minutes turned into half an hour, Alison began to worry. She called Catherine's home phone repeatedly, but no one answered. She tried calling the school, thinking that Catherine might have gone in to work on weekend projects, but there was no answer there either. By 1 o'clock, Alison was genuinely concerned about her sister's whereabouts. Alison left the restaurant and drove directly to Catherine's townhome, hoping to find a simple explanation for the missed lunch appointment. Perhaps Catherine had overslept, or her alarm clock had malfunctioned, or she had become so absorbed in weekend projects that she had lost track of time. These were all possibilities that would be easily resolved with a quick conversation. But when Alison arrived at the townhome and knocked on the front door, there was no response. Catherine's car was parked in its usual spot, indicating that she was likely home. Alison knocked louder and called out her sister's name, but the townhome remained silent. Growing increasingly worried, Alison used her spare key to enter the residence. Alison entered Catherine's townhome through the front door, calling out her sister's name as she stepped into the foyer. The house was quiet, which was unusual for a Saturday when Catherine typically had music playing while she worked on household tasks or lesson planning. The silence felt heavy and wrong, setting Alison's nerves on edge as she moved through the familiar rooms. The living room appeared normal at first glance. Catherine's grading materials were stacked neatly on the coffee table, and her lesson plan book was open to the upcoming week's schedule. Nothing seemed disturbed or out of place, but the absence of any signs of life, no television sounds, no radio music, no movement from anywhere in the house, created an atmosphere of unease that made Alison's heart beat faster. "Catherine?" Alison called again, moving toward the kitchen. "Are you here? You missed our lunch." Her voice echoed through the empty rooms, amplifying her growing anxiety. The kitchen was also neat and orderly, with clean dishes in the drying rack and no signs that Catherine had prepared breakfast that morning. Alison climbed the stairs to the second floor, where Catherine's bedroom and home office were located. The floorboards creaked under her feet, sounds that seemed unusually loud in the oppressive silence. At the top of the stairs, she paused and called her sister's name once more before approaching the master bedroom. The bedroom door was partially closed, which was unusual. Catherine typically left her bedroom door open during the day, closing it only when she was sleeping or getting dressed. Alison pushed the door open and stepped inside, expecting to find her sister taking a nap, or perhaps feeling ill and resting in bed. Instead, she discovered a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Catherine was lying motionless beside her bathtub in the master bathroom, her body positioned in a way that immediately indicated something terrible had happened. Her hands were secured behind her back with metal handcuffs, and it was clear that she was not breathing. The sight was so shocking and horrific that Alison's mind initially refused to process what she was seeing. For several seconds, Alison stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move or speak. Her identical twin sister, her closest friend and confidant, was clearly dead under circumstances that were obviously violent and criminal. The woman who had shared every important moment of her life was gone, taken in a way that was both brutal and incomprehensible. Training from her nursing career finally kicked in, and Alison forced herself to approach her sister's body to check for any signs of life. But it was immediately clear that Catherine had been dead for some time. Her skin was cold to the touch, and the positioning of her body indicated that she had been deceased for hours. Alison's hands shook as she reached for the telephone beside Catherine's bed and dialed 911. The emergency dispatcher who answered would later comment that Alison's voice was barely audible as she struggled to explain what she had discovered. "My sister is dead," Alison managed to say. "Someone killed her. Please send help." The dispatcher kept Alison on the line while police and paramedics were dispatched to the townhome. Alison was instructed not to touch anything else in the house and to wait outside for emergency responders to arrive. She sat on the front steps, still holding the cordless phone, staring at nothing while trying to process the impossible reality of what she had just witnessed. Within minutes, the quiet residential neighborhood was transformed into a chaotic crime scene. Police cars arrived with sirens wailing, followed by paramedics, detectives, and forensic technicians. Yellow tape was stretched around Catherine's townhome, and neighbors began gathering to see what was happening in their normally peaceful community. Detective Carmen Brown, Apple, was among the first officers to arrive at the scene. As she approached the townhome, she realized that she recognized the victim's name from the dispatch report. Catherine Edwards had been a sorority sister during their college years, and they had maintained a casual friendship even after graduation. "I went to college with her," Detective Apple would later recall. "We were in sororities together. She was so full of life and energy. To come to the scene and then suddenly realize it was Mary Catherine, it just knocked me for a minute." The personal connection made the case even more difficult for Detective Apple, but it also strengthened her determination to find justice for Catherine. She knew that this was not just another homicide case, but the murder of someone who had dedicated her life to helping children and making her community a better place. As Detective Apple and her colleagues began processing the crime scene, they discovered evidence that would prove crucial to the investigation. The bedroom and bathroom showed signs of a violent struggle, with furniture overturned and personal items scattered across the floor. Catherine had fought desperately for her life, leaving behind evidence that would eventually help identify her killer. The most significant piece of evidence was biological material that had been left on Catherine's bedspread during the attack. The perpetrator had also left DNA evidence from a sexual assault, providing investigators with genetic material that could potentially identify the killer if he was ever arrested and entered into the criminal database system. The crime scene also revealed that Catherine's death had not been quick or merciful. She had been tortured and terrorized before being killed, indicating that the perpetrator had spent considerable time in her home. The handcuffs used to restrain her were not found at the scene, suggesting that the killer had brought them specifically for the attack and taken them when he left. Detective Apple and her team spent hours documenting every detail of the crime scene. They photographed the bedroom and bathroom from multiple angles, collected biological evidence, and dusted for fingerprints on every surface that might yield useful information. The investigation was thorough and professional, but the brutality of the crime was emotionally difficult for everyone involved. Allison was interviewed extensively about her sister's life, relationships, and recent activities. The questions were painful but necessary as investigators tried to understand who might have targeted Catherine and why. Allison provided detailed information about Catherine's daily routines, her work at the school, her social relationships, and any concerns she might have expressed about feeling unsafe or threatened. The interview revealed that Catherine had not mentioned any problems at work, had not reported receiving threatening communications, and had not expressed concerns about anyone in her life. She was well liked by students, parents, and colleagues, and had no known enemies or individuals who might wish her harm. Her life was quiet, stable, and focused on her career and family relationships. Catherine's parents, Dr. Edwards and Patricia, were devastated by the news of their daughter's murder. They drove immediately to Beaumont from their home several hours away, arriving to find their daughter's townhome surrounded by police vehicles and crime scene tape. The sight of investigators carrying evidence bags from the house where Catherine had built her independent adult life was almost too much for them to bear. The initial investigation expanded quickly to include interviews with Catherine's colleagues at the school, neighbors in her townhome complex, and anyone else who might have information about her recent activities or interactions. The interviews painted a consistent picture of a woman who was dedicated to her work, close to her family, and living a quiet life without apparent threats or conflicts. As the first day of the investigation concluded, Detective Apple and her team had collected substantial evidence but had not identified any obvious suspects or motives for Catherine's murder. The crime appeared to have been committed by someone who was either a stranger to Catherine or someone who had concealed their intentions and their capacity for violence very effectively. The investigation into Catherine Edwards' murder began immediately with a comprehensive examination of the crime scene and interviews with everyone who had known or interacted with her recently. Detective Apple coordinated with the Beaumont Police Department's Major Crimes Unit to ensure that every possible lead would be pursued and every piece of evidence would be analyzed thoroughly. The forensic evidence collected from Catherine's townhome was extensive and detailed. The biological material found on her bedspread and from the sexual assault kit would prove to be crucial in the eventual identification of her killer, but in 1995 DNA technology was still in its early stages and could not provide immediate answers. The DNA sample was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, which was designed to compare genetic evidence from crime scenes against DNA profiles of known offenders. However, the database was relatively small in 1995, containing only profiles from individuals who had been convicted of certain felonies and required to provide DNA samples. When no matches were found in CODIS, investigators knew that Catherine's killer was either someone who had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, or someone whose DNA had not yet been entered into the system. This meant that the investigation would need to rely on traditional detective work rather than technological shortcuts. Detective Apple began conducting interviews with everyone who had been part of Catherine's life during the weeks and months before her murder. She spoke with teaching colleagues who worked closely with Catherine, administrators at the school where she taught, parents of students in her classes, and neighbors who lived in her townhome complex. The interviews consistently portrayed Catherine as someone who was well-liked, professionally successful, and personally stable. Her teaching colleagues described her as dedicated and hard-working, someone who stayed late to help struggling students and never complained about the additional responsibilities she took on voluntarily. Parents praised her patience and creativity in the classroom, and many credited her with helping their children develop a love of learning. Catherine's principal provided Detective Apple with detailed information about Catherine's work schedule, recent interactions with parents and students, and any problems or conflicts that might have occurred at school. The review revealed nothing unusual or concerning. Catherine had not reported any problems with students, parents, or colleagues, and there were no disciplinary issues or conflicts that might have motivated someone to target her. Neighbors in Catherine's townhome complex were interviewed about their observations of her daily routines and any unusual activity they might have noticed in the days before her murder. Most neighbors knew Catherine by sight and described her as quiet, friendly, and responsible. She was often seen carrying schoolwork to and from her car, tending to her small garden, or chatting briefly with neighbors she encountered while checking her mail. Several neighbors reported that they had noticed an increase in unfamiliar vehicles in the parking areas around the townhome complex during the weeks before Catherine's murder. However, none could provide detailed descriptions of the vehicles or their occupants. The complex was home to young professionals who often had visitors, so unfamiliar cars were not necessarily suspicious or memorable. Detective Apple also investigated Catherine's personal relationships, including her dating history and social activities. The investigation revealed that Catherine had not been in a serious romantic relationship at the time of her murder. She had dated occasionally, but had not introduced any romantic partners to her family or close friends recently. Catherine's social life was centered around her family, her work, and her church activities. She participated in teacher gatherings and school events, attended family celebrations and holiday gatherings, and volunteered for various church programs that served the community. Her activities brought her into contact with many people, but none of the relationships appeared to have romantic or sexual components that might have led to jealousy or conflict. The investigation expanded to include registered sex offenders in the Beaumont area, individuals with histories of violence against women, and anyone who might have had access to Catherine's townhome or information about her daily routines. Detective Apple worked with other law enforcement agencies to identify potential suspects who might have been in the area at the time of the murder. A careful examination of Catherine's work life revealed that she had interacted with hundreds of parents throughout her teaching career. While most of these interactions were positive and professional, Detective Apple investigated whether any parents might have developed inappropriate feelings toward Catherine or might have had conflicts with her about their children's education or behavior. The investigation also considered the possibility that Catherine's murder might have been connected to her volunteer work at church or her participation in community service activities. She had worked with various charitable organizations and had contact with individuals from different backgrounds and circumstances who might have been seeking assistance or services. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to lose momentum despite the dedicated efforts of Detective Apple and her colleagues. The DNA evidence remained unmatched in criminal databases. No witnesses had come forward with useful information, and traditional investigative techniques had not identified any promising suspects or motives. The case was featured in local media coverage that included photographs of Catherine, details about her life and career, and appeals for anyone with information to contact police. The coverage generated several tips from the public, but none provided the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. Catherine's family struggled with the lack of progress in the investigation, while also dealing with their grief and the traumatic nature of her death. Emerson found it particularly difficult to process the loss of her twin sister under such violent and senseless circumstances. The bond they had shared made Catherine's absence feel like losing part of herself. Dr. Edwards and Patricia became advocates for victims' rights and supported legislation that would expand DNA database requirements and improve resources for investigating violent crimes. Their advocacy work helped them channel their grief into positive action while keeping Catherine's memory alive and pushing for changes that might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The first anniversary of Catherine's murder passed without resolution, despite continued efforts by Detective Apple and periodic reviews of the evidence. The case remained active, but without new leads or technological developments, progress seemed unlikely. The investigation had reached the frustrating point where all available avenues had been explored without producing the answers that Catherine's family deserved. As 1996 arrived, the investigation into Catherine Edwards' murder officially entered the cold case phase. Detective Apple continued to review the file periodically and submit the DNA evidence for comparison whenever the GODIS database was updated with new offender profiles, but matches remained elusive. The lack of progress was particularly frustrating because investigators knew they had strong evidence that should eventually lead to the killer's identification. The DNA profile was clear and complete, providing a genetic fingerprint that would definitively identify the perpetrator if he could be located and tested. But without a suspect to compare the evidence against, the case remained unsolved. Allison struggled with the reality that her sister's killer remained free while she tried to rebuild her life without her closest friend and confidant. The twin bond they had shared made Catherine's absence particularly acute. Allison found herself reaching for the phone to call Catherine about daily events before remembering that her sister was gone forever. The impact on Catherine's parents was equally devastating. Dr. Edwards had devoted his career to saving lives and helping people heal from injuries and illnesses. The knowledge that someone had deliberately taken his daughter's life in such a brutal manner challenged his faith in humanity and his understanding of justice. Patricia channeled her grief into volunteer work with victims' rights organizations and support groups for families of murder victims. She understood the unique pain of losing a loved one to violence and the additional trauma of not knowing who was responsible or whether justice would ever be served. The school where Catherine had taught created a memorial scholarship in her honor, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in education. Her classroom was eventually assigned to another teacher, but Catherine's influence on the school community continued through the scholarship program and the memories of colleagues who had worked with her. Detective Apple retired in 2001, after working the Edwards case for 6 years without achieving resolution. She passed the file to Detective Tina Llewellyn, an experienced investigator who brought fresh perspective to the evidence and witness statements. Detective Llewellyn reviewed every aspect of the case, re-interviewed key witnesses, and consulted with experts about potential new approaches to the investigation. The early 2000s brought significant advances in DNA technology and analysis techniques. Detective Llewellyn submitted Catherine's evidence for updated testing that could extract more detailed genetic information and provide better comparison capabilities. The results confirmed the quality of the DNA profile, but still produced no matches in criminal databases. As social media and internet communications became more common, Detective Llewellyn used these tools to generate new interest in Catherine's case. Online forums dedicated to true crime cases began discussing the murder, with amateur investigators sharing theories and encouraging anyone with information to contact police. The renewed attention brought several new tips, but none led to significant developments. The 10th anniversary of Catherine's murder in 2005 prompted another round of media coverage and public appeals for information. Articles in local newspapers reminded the community about the unsolved case and encouraged anyone with knowledge about the crime to come forward. The coverage generated phone calls to police, but none provided the breakthrough investigators needed. Detective Llewellyn continued working the case even as she took on new investigations and responsibilities. She periodically contacted other law enforcement agencies to see if they had any unsolved cases with similar evidence patterns or methods of operation. She attended conferences about cold case investigations and consulted with experts about new techniques that might be applicable to Catherine's murder. In 2010, 15 years after Catherine's death, Detective Llewellyn retired and passed the case to a new generation of investigators. The file had grown thick with reports, witness statements, and evidence analyses, but the central mystery remained unsolved. Catherine's killer had successfully evaded justice for a decade and a half. The investigation continued under the supervision of Detective Marcus Thompson, who applied new technologies and investigative approaches to the evidence. Advanced DNA analysis techniques were becoming available that could extract genetic information from smaller and more degraded samples than had been possible in previous years. By 2015, 20 years after Catherine's murder, her case had been reviewed by multiple investigators and subjected to various technological advances without producing the identification of her killer. The DNA evidence remained strong and viable, but without a suspect to compare it against, the investigation seemed to have reached an impasse. Allison had married and started a family of her own, but she continued to advocate for her sister's case and maintain contact with investigators. She participated in cold case awareness events and supported other families dealing with unsolved murders. Her advocacy work helped keep Catherine's memory alive while pushing for continued efforts to solve the case. The 25th anniversary of Catherine's murder in 2020 marked a quarter-century without justice for her family. Local media coverage reminded the community about the unsolved case, but public interest had diminished over the years as new crimes captured attention and resources. Detective Thompson knew that solving Catherine's case would require new approaches or technological breakthroughs that could overcome the limitations that had frustrated investigators for decades. The evidence was solid, the investigation had been thorough, and the determination to find justice remained strong. What was needed was a scientific advance that could finally connect the DNA evidence to Catherine's killer. Unknown to Detective Thompson and Catherine's family, revolutionary developments in forensic science were about to transform cold case investigations and provide new hope for solving crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. In 2020, 25 years after Catherine Edwards' murder, Detective Thompson learned about revolutionary advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy that were solving cold cases across the country. A specialized forensic laboratory called Othram Incorporated had developed techniques that could extract genetic information from evidence that had previously been considered too degraded to analyze. More importantly, Othram's approach combined advanced DNA sequencing with genetic genealogy research that could identify potential suspects even when their DNA was not in criminal databases. The process involved comparing crime scene DNA against publicly available genealogy databases and building family trees that could lead to the identification of the perpetrator. Detective Thompson contacted Othram to discuss the possibility of analyzing the DNA evidence from Catherine's murder. The laboratory's representatives explained that their techniques had been successful in solving cases that were decades old and had been considered unsolvable using traditional methods. Othram's genetic genealogy team was led by experts who specialized in building family trees from DNA evidence and identifying individuals who might be related to unknown subjects. The process was complex and time-consuming, but it had already produced remarkable results in cases where investigators had exhausted all other options. In September of 2020, Detective Thompson submitted the biological evidence from Catherine's murder to Othram for advanced analysis. The laboratory began the painstaking process of extracting and amplifying genetic material that could be used for genealogical research and suspect identification. While Othram worked on the genetic analysis, Detective Thompson used the waiting period to review the case file once again, with the perspective of 25 years of accumulated investigative experience. She re-examined witness statements, crime scene photographs, and evidence inventories, looking for details that might have been overlooked or undervalued during previous investigations. One aspect of the case that caught Detective Thompson's attention was the geographical and social connections within the Beaumont community. Catherine had lived and worked in the area for her entire adult life, interacting with hundreds of people through her teaching career, church activities, and daily routines. The killer might have been someone who had crossed paths with Catherine in ways that had not been obvious to earlier investigators. Detective Thompson began creating databases of individuals who had attended the same high school as Catherine, worked in the school district where she taught, or participated in activities and organizations that might have brought them into contact with her. The approach was labor-intensive, but advances in computer databases and record-keeping made it possible to analyze connections that would have been difficult to identify in previous decades. In January of 2021, Othram contacted Detective Thompson with extraordinary news. The laboratory had successfully created a detailed genetic profile from the biological evidence and had identified potential family connections through genealogical research. Working with genetic genealogist Cheryl Lapointe, Othram had built a family tree that pointed to a specific individual as Catherine's likely killer. The genetic genealogy process had involved comparing the perpetrator's DNA profile against profiles in public genealogy databases like GADMatch-Pro. When partial matches were found, genealogists constructed detailed family trees that traced relationships back several generations and forward to identify living descendants who might be related to the person who left DNA at Catherine's crime scene. After months of genealogical research and investigation, the team had identified Clayton Foreman as the individual whose DNA most likely matched the evidence from Catherine's murder. Foreman was a 58-year-old man who lived in Ohio and worked as a rideshare driver, but who had significant connections to the Beaumont community where Catherine had lived and died. Detective Thompson began investigating Clayton Foreman's background and discovered connections to Catherine that were both shocking and enlightening. Foreman had grown up in Beaumont and had attended the same high school as Catherine, though they had been in different graduating classes. More significantly, Catherine and her twin sister Allison had served as bridesmaids in Foreman's wedding to his first wife in 1982. The discovery that Catherine's killer had been someone she knew personally, someone who had been part of her social circle and had even included her in his wedding celebration, was devastating to her family and shocking to investigators. The revelation suggested that Catherine's murder had not been a random crime committed by a stranger, but rather a planned attack by someone who had access to information about her life and routines. Detective Thompson's investigation also revealed that Foreman had a criminal history that predated Catherine's murder. In 1981, he had been arrested and charged with the sexual assault of a woman named Paula Ramsey. However, he had pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of aggravated assault and received 3 years of probation instead of prison time. The details of Foreman's assault on Paula Ramsey bore striking similarities to Catherine's murder. Both crimes involved sexual violence, restraints, and prolonged torture of the victims. The connection suggested that Catherine's murder might not have been Foreman's first serious violent crime, but rather an escalation of a pattern of behavior that had begun years earlier. Routine DNA collection from criminal offenders did not begin until the mid to late 1990s, which explained why Foreman's DNA had never been entered into CODIS despite his criminal history. The timing meant that even though he had been convicted of a violent crime, his genetic profile was not available for comparison when Catherine's murder was investigated in 1995. Detective Thompson coordinated with law enforcement agencies in Ohio to approach Foreman for questioning and DNA collection. The investigation required careful planning to ensure that evidence would be properly collected and that Foreman's constitutional rights would be protected throughout the process. In March of 2021, Ohio investigators contacted Foreman at his residence and requested that he provide DNA samples for comparison against evidence from a cold case investigation. Foreman agreed to cooperate and provided the samples voluntarily, appearing calm and cooperative during the interaction. The DNA samples were immediately sent to forensic laboratories for comparison against the evidence from Catherine's murder scene. Within days, the results confirmed what genetic genealogy had predicted. Clayton Foreman was the source of the biological evidence found on Catherine's bedspread and from the sexual assault kit. After 26 years of investigation, police finally had definitive proof of who had murdered Catherine Edwards. The arrest of Clayton Foreman for Catherine Edwards' murder on March 23, 2021, brought both relief and renewed pain to her family members who had waited 26 years for answers. Detective Thompson personally called Allison to inform her that the man who had killed her twin sister had been identified and was in custody. "We have arrested the man who murdered Catherine," Detective Thompson said during the emotional phone call. "His name is Clayton Foreman, and you actually know him. He was in Catherine's wedding party when he married his first wife." The revelation that Catherine's killer had been someone she knew personally, someone who had been trusted enough to include in a wedding celebration, was almost as shocking as the original crime itself. Allison struggled to process the information, while also feeling relief that the long wait for justice was finally ending. Foreman was transported from Ohio to Texas to face charges of capital murder in connection with Catherine's death. If convicted, he could face the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecutor's office expressed confidence that the DNA evidence, combined with Foreman's criminal history and the circumstances of the crime, would result in a conviction. The legal proceedings began with extensive pretrial motions and evidence hearings as Foreman's defense attorneys challenged various aspects of the case. They questioned the reliability of genetic genealogy techniques, the handling of evidence over 26 years, and the connection between Foreman's previous criminal conviction and Catherine's murder. Prosecutors built their case around the irrefutable DNA evidence that connected Foreman to Catherine's murder, his previous conviction for sexual assault that demonstrated a pattern of violent behavior, and the personal relationship between Foreman and Catherine that gave him access to information about her life and routines. One of the most powerful moments in the preparation for trial came when prosecutors contacted Paula Ramsey, the woman whom Foreman had sexually assaulted in 1981. Ramsey had struggled for decades with the trauma of the attack and the knowledge that Foreman had received only probation instead of prison time for his crime. "I just felt awful and shameful," Ramsey explained when contacted by prosecutors. "I was just like, I will never tell anybody what happened. I was kind of like, I do not know if anybody would believe me. Is it my fault? Was it my fault?" Despite her initial reluctance to relive the traumatic experience, Ramsey agreed to testify at Foreman's trial for Catherine's murder. She understood that her testimony could help establish a pattern of violent behavior that would strengthen the case against Catherine's killer. "I wanted to see justice done for her," Ramsey said about her decision to testify. "Catherine deserved justice, and if my testimony could help achieve that, then I was willing to do whatever was necessary." The trial began in September of 2024, nearly 29 years after Catherine's murder. The courtroom was filled with Catherine's family members, former colleagues from the school where she taught, and community members who remembered her impact on their children's education and development. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Foreman's guilt. The DNA match was scientifically irrefutable, connecting him definitively to the crime scene and the sexual assault of Catherine. Expert witnesses explained the genetic genealogy process that had led to his identification and the reliability of modern DNA analysis techniques. The prosecution also presented evidence about Foreman's personal relationship with Catherine and her family. Photographs from his 1982 wedding showed Catherine and Allison serving as bridesmaids, smiling and celebrating what should have been a joyous occasion. The images created a stark contrast to the brutal crime that Foreman would commit against Catherine 13 years later. Paula Ramsey's testimony provided crucial evidence about Foreman's history of sexual violence and his methods of attacking victims. Her detailed account of the 1981 assault demonstrated striking similarities to Catherine's murder, including the use of restraints, sexual violence, and prolonged torture. Foreman's defense attorneys attempted to challenge the DNA evidence and suggest that genetic genealogy techniques were not reliable enough to support a murder conviction. They also tried to argue that the 1981 assault was not relevant to Catherine's murder and should not be considered by the jury. However, the evidence against Foreman was overwhelming and scientifically sound. The DNA match was confirmed by multiple laboratories using different testing methods, and the genetic genealogy process that led to his identification was thoroughly documented and peer-reviewed. On October 15, 2024, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges. Clayton Foreman was convicted of capital murder in the death of Catherine Edwards and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a mixture of relief and sadness to Catherine's family. Justice had finally been served, but no legal proceeding could restore the life that had been taken or repair the decades of pain that her murder had caused. Catherine was 31 years old when she was murdered, Allison said after the trial. She was just beginning to hit her stride as a teacher, just starting to make the impact on students' lives that she had always dreamed about. She will never get to see the children she taught grow up and succeed, never get to experience the career achievements she was working toward, never get to have the family she wanted to build. Detective Thompson, who had worked tirelessly to solve the case, felt satisfaction in achieving justice for Catherine, but also sadness about the decades that had passed before the truth was revealed. "This case shows that we never give up," she said. "Technology continues to advance, and cases that seem impossible to solve can still be resolved if we maintain our commitment to finding answers." The resolution of Catherine's murder after 29 years demonstrated the power of persistence and the incredible advances in forensic science that are bringing justice to families around the world. It also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence from crime scenes and continuing to pursue cold cases, even when traditional investigative methods have been exhausted. For the Beaumont community where Catherine had lived and taught, the case brought closure to a tragedy that had haunted residents for decades. The knowledge that her killer had been identified, convicted, and would never be able to harm anyone else provided a sense of safety and resolution that had been missing since 1995. Foreman is currently serving his life sentence and has indicated that he plans to appeal his conviction. However, the strength of the DNA evidence and the thoroughness of the investigation make it unlikely that his appeals will be successful. The conviction of Clayton Foreman for Catherine Edwards' murder marked the end of a 29-year journey toward justice, but it also highlighted important lessons about the evolution of forensic science and the dedication required to solve complex cold cases. The case became a symbol of hope for families dealing with unsolved crimes and a testament to the power of never giving up on the pursuit of truth. Allison found that the resolution of her sister's case brought both closure and a renewed sense of purpose. While nothing could bring Catherine back or restore the relationship they had shared, knowing that her killer would never be able to harm anyone else provided a sense of peace that had been missing for decades. "I have been living with this for 29 years, Allison reflected after the trial. Every time I achieved something in my life, Every time my children reached a milestone, every time I experienced joy or success, there was always this shadow of knowing that the person who killed Catherine was free while we suffered. Finally seeing him held accountable means everything to our family. The advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy techniques that solved Catherine's case represented a revolution in forensic science that was transforming cold case investigations across the country. Othrum's success in identifying Foreman demonstrated that even decades-old cases with limited evidence could be solved using these innovative approaches. Detective Thompson became an advocate for using advanced DNA technology in other unsolved cases throughout Texas and beyond. She worked with prosecutors and police administrators to identify additional cold cases that might benefit from genetic genealogy analysis, understanding that the techniques that solved Catherine's murder could bring justice to other families who had been waiting for answers. The case also highlighted the importance of victims' advocates like Paula Ramsey, whose courage in testifying about her own assault helped establish the pattern of behavior that strengthened the case against Foreman. Her willingness to relive traumatic experiences for the sake of justice demonstrated the interconnected nature of violent crimes and the importance of supporting all victims of sexual violence. Catherine's legacy extended far beyond the resolution of her murder case. The memorial scholarship established in her honor continued to provide financial assistance to students pursuing careers in education, ensuring that her commitment to helping children would continue to impact future generations. Former students who had been taught by Catherine reached out to her family after the trial to share memories of how she had influenced their lives and education. Many credited her with instilling a love of learning that had shaped their academic and professional achievements. These testimonials provided comfort to Catherine's family and demonstrated the lasting impact of her dedication to teaching. The school where Catherine had worked established an annual award in her memory, recognizing teachers who demonstrated exceptional dedication to student success and community involvement. The award served as a reminder of Catherine's values and encouraged other educators to follow her example of going above and beyond for their students. Dr. Edwards and Patricia, Catherine's parents, continued their advocacy work for victims' rights and support for families dealing with unsolved crimes. Their efforts helped secure funding for additional cold case investigations and improved resources for families navigating the criminal justice system. The resolution of Catherine's case after nearly 3 decades proved that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, but it also underscored the importance of not allowing cases to remain unsolved for so long. The advances in forensic science that made Foreman's identification possible should be applied more broadly to cold cases across the country. Clayton Foreman's conviction served as a warning to other perpetrators of violent crimes that scientific advances would eventually catch up with them, regardless of how much time had passed. The case demonstrated that DNA evidence could remain viable for decades, and that new techniques would continue to be developed that could solve previously unsolvable crimes. For the broader law enforcement community, Catherine's case provided a model for how genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis could be integrated into cold case investigations. The successful collaboration between local detectives, specialized laboratories, and genetic genealogists showed that solving complex cases required expertise from multiple disciplines working together toward a common goal. The case also emphasized the emotional toll that unsolved murders take on families, communities, and investigators. The 29 years between Catherine's death and Foreman's conviction represented decades of uncertainty, grief, and frustration for everyone who had been affected by the crime. Catherine Edwards' case proves that no matter how much time passes, justice remains possible when dedicated investigators refuse to give up, and when scientific advances provide new tools for solving old mysteries. If this account has moved you, please share it with others who might find hope in knowing that even the most challenging cases can eventually be resolved. Your engagement helps ensure that other families still waiting for answers know they are not forgotten, and that the pursuit of justice never truly ends. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the most mind-bending cases from around the world.